In your opening remarks, sir, you said about Iran that you were appalled and outraged. What took you so long to say those words?
I don't think that's accurate. Track what I've been saying.
Were you influenced at all by John McCain and Lindsey Graham accusing you of being timid and weak?
What do you think?
Ow. Ow. The president at his press conference today giving rhetorical wedgies to reporters who asked what he plainly thought were ill-informed or off-base questions about his position on Iran. In addition to the questions on Iran, the president led today's press conference with a lengthy statement about the uprising in Iran that didn't necessarily go further than anything he had said previously, but it did inexplicably nevertheless earn him headlines and questions from reporters that implied that he had gone significantly further. Here's some of what he said today.
I've made it clear that the United States respects the sovereignty of the Islamic Republic of Iran and is not interfering with Iran's affairs. But we must also bear witness to the courage and the dignity of the Iranian people and to a remarkable opening within Iranian society. And we deplore the violence against innocent civilians anywhere that it takes place. The Iranian people have a universal right to assembly and free speech. If the Iranian government seeks the respect of the international community, it must respect those rights and heed the will of its own people.
That was a statement being billed everywhere as a dramatic escalation of the president's stance on Iran. Except when you look back at his previous statements, he was saying pretty much the same thing even more than a week ago. Here, for example, was what he said last Monday.
We respect Iranian sovereignty and want to avoid the United States being the issue inside of Iran. Having said all that, I am deeply troubled by the violence that I've been seeing on television. I think that the democratic process, free speech, the ability of people to peacefully dissent, all those are universal values and need to be respected.
That was more than a week ago. That was the Monday right after the election in Iran. The day after that, here's what the president told CNBC's John Harwood.
My hope is that the regime responds not with violence, but with a recognition that the universal principles of peaceful expression and democracy are ones that should be affirmed.
You noticing a theme here, certain similarity in the president's comments? You should be. On Saturday, he said this. He said, quote, "The Iranian government must understand that the world is watching. We mourn each and every innocent life that is lost. We call on the Iranian government to stop all violent and unjust actions against its own people. The universal rights to assembly and free speech must be respected, and the United States stands with all who seek to exercise those rights." It all kind of sounds the same, doesn't it? It's because it has been. Despite the inexplicable headlines today about how tough the president suddenly got on Iran, when you look at what President Obama has actually said in his repeated statements since the Iranian election, it's sort of meet the tough new stance, same as the tough old stance. So leaving aside what I find to be utterly inexplicable Washington common wisdom on this subject today, which does not seem to me to be at all based in fact, the real question remains, what has been the effect of Obama's statements on Iran? It's not something that's theoretical right now. We can see the impact of his statements in terms of the way they're being used, the way they're being distorted. And it's now appropriate to ask, is America being used as a political football by the regime in Iran? Joining us now is someone who knows a thing or two about diplomatic specificity. She is former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. Madam Secretary, thank you so much for coming on the show tonight.
Good to be with you, Rachel. Very nice to see you again.
Thank you. So the president has been criticized on the right in American politics for not doing enough with respect to Iran. I wonder if it's worth starting to ask now if it's possible that he's doing too much, if these statements that he's made about Iran have been used against the interest of the opposition forces.
Well, I think he's taken absolutely the right tack, and I'm very interested in the way that you have really codified to show that he's been saying the same thing and very appropriately, and I think being very concerned about not being used as a football. I think he's made that point also a number of times. I think that it is bound to happen as the Iranian regime feels increasingly under pressure that they are looking for outside excuses. They had already blamed the British. They had blamed us for a number of things before. But I think the president's taken absolutely the right tack in sympathizing with the crowds, in understanding the complications of the situation, and making clear what the international community stands for.
In terms of specific decisions that the president and the administration as a whole has to make about what to do about Iran, there's a very interesting question today from Nico Pitney at the Huffington Post, and I think it's received more attention for the fact that the president called on Mr. Pitney than what the question was itself. But he asked, essentially, what the U.S. government is going to do when it comes time to decide whether or not we're going to call him President Ahmadinejad, whether we are actually going to recognize that government when Ahmadinejad, if and when he is sworn in. Does the U.S. really have a decision to make there? Do we have to call him president and recognize him as president because that regime will say that he is?
Well, first of all, we have no diplomatic relations with Iran, and we have been dealing through a European group of ministers and through various other intermediaries, so I don't think the question will come up. I think the issue is ultimately what are U.S. national interests, and I believe that the president said that. We are very concerned about the direction Iran is going in on the nuclear program, and ultimately I think we have to figure out how to deal with that. But we don't have diplomatic relations with them, which is one of the issues that we don't have to decide what we're going to call him. But I have to say this, Rachel, we have dealt with a lot of odious people in order to deal with issues that are larger. For instance, we dealt with Stalin, we dealt with Mao Zedong, we have dealt with other people that we don't like when we have to deal with America's national interests, and the truth is that the nuclear proliferation is one of the biggest problems that we have.
In terms of what is going to happen in Iran, what sort of the end game is here, with all of the national and international transformations that you've seen and that you've been part of as Secretary of State and in your other diplomatic roles, what do you see as the range of possible outcomes here? Is it possible that Mousavi will end up being president? Is it possible that Iran ends up with a new structure of government because of this uprising?
Well, I think anything's possible, but I do think what is fascinating, Rachel, is that while something might not happen immediately, from everything that I have studied about Iran, this is a sea change. All these hundreds of thousands of people out there, and fascinatingly enough, as you've said, calling for, God is great, they are not trying to show that they're not religious. They want to see their country respected. And so there are those that are real Iranian experts who say that nothing will ever be the same. I do think that the Ayatollahs and the regime have a great deal of strength, and the courage of the crowds are amazing, but it's very hard to tell where this is going, except to say that nothing will ever be the same in Iran.
One thing that I think has been surprising and interesting as an American watching this is how engaged Americans are with this story, how much hunger there is for information about this, how emotionally engaged we are with this struggle that's played out in Iran's streets. Is there anything that the American people, not our government, but American citizens should do or could do to sort of, I guess, have an active furtherance to sort of evince how we've been moved by what we've seen happening there?
Well, it's kind of a two-level thing, and it's interesting you ask it that way, because I think the government, the U.S. government, has to be very careful not to become the football, as we've been saying, and not to be the story. On the other hand, dissidents and those who protest around the world are always very encouraged when they know that Americans care. And through all this modern technology, it is so evident that we always are on the side of those who want freedom. And for me, Rachel, what this shows is democracy is alive and well. People question whether people want to make decisions about their own lives. And what you're seeing out there on the streets is people want to be in control of their own lives, and democracy from below is something that is a very, very powerful movement.
Former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, it is always a real honor to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Rachel.